T-minus 50 seconds. T-minus 40 seconds. T-minus 30 seconds. T-minus 20 seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
I'm talking today with New York State Congressional candidate Maron, New York District 10. We're about to have a very interesting conversation, and I think that because of the way that we met actually was very interesting. Maud is actually running as a Democrat. As all of you know, I'm a former Democrat who started the Walk Away campaign. Maud reached out to me privately on Twitter saying that she wanted to have a discussion about the overlap of issues that we might connect on and things that we might not connect on. And I said to her, you know what, I think this would be a great conversation to have on camera. And so we basically decided to come together today and have this conversation for all of you to be able to watch. I think it's going to be really interesting. And with that, let's dive right in and get right to work. Maud, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
Hey, Brandon, it's great to be here. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we maybe start at the very beginning, which for us is quite new. We just got to know each other. What compelled you to reach out to me on Twitter?
Well, I'll say this. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I've been a Democrat for 33 years now, I think. Dating myself a lot there, but I've been a Democrat for a long time. And so many people in New York have taken, so many Democrats in New York have taken to calling themselves politically homeless. And I had heard about the walkaway movement and didn't know a whole heck of a lot about it. And then I saw you actually on the Tucker Carlson show, and I heard you saying a version of things, your frustration with the Democratic Party, that I've heard from moms who are frustrated with the school lockdowns, and I find that if people talk to each other, we find these commonalities. We find the things that are driving us either out of the Democratic Party or driving us into the arms of different, political affiliations. But at the base of it, at the core of it, I have all these people who were generally, I think, we're Democrats for the same reason probably you were, Brandon, and I am now, because I think, look, it's hard for me to remember when I was a teenager, but I was a teenager once. And if you go back that far, for me, the choice between Democrat and Republican was like, I thought Republicans were a bunch of rich jerks who didn't care about the environment and didn't care about workers and didn't care about labor rights. And the Democrats were the good people who cared about the environment and who cared about the labor movement and now in my city, the Democratic Party is the one who fired a bunch of cops and teachers and for not taking a vaccine. The Democrats are the ones who kicked public school kids out of school for the longest. Like, I'm starting to have trouble reconciling my party leadership with the party that I joined decades ago. And I know some people say, just leave, just leave, walk away as you have. But in New York City, we almost always send Democrats to Congress, the differential rate and who's registered. So if you want to have a voice in your city, in most districts in New York, you register as a Democrat. Actually, in our last mayoral election, a lot of Republicans switched their registration to Democrat in New York just so they could vote for the mayor, because they know in New York, we all know, because of how many registered Republicans and Democrats we have, that the Democratic primary is the mayoral election in most cases, right? There have been exceptions, but in most cases, that's it. So this is a really long answer, Brandon. I'm sorry I'm giving you such a long answer, but these are issues that moms like me and other Democratic New Yorkers have been talking about for years, and I don't think we have like a great answer yet. And that's kind of why I wanted to talk to you to find, you found your own answer and to talk to you about how it's going.
Okay, so you said several things here that really resonated with me, and I want to be honest with you. I'm going to try to take a step back, and not, because you are, to me, exactly the kind of person I would want to step in and say, I feel like you're this close to walking away. But my goal today is to actually hear your story and hear what's on your mind, not to persuade you to fully walk away from the left. So, but so much of what you said just totally resonated with me completely, because I agree. For me personally, I always saw the Republican Party as the party of greedy, self-interested, straight white men, and the Democrat Party is the party of people who cared about marginalized minorities, who were compassionate, who cared about the environment. So I agree so much with what you said and your perceptions of why you have felt like you aligned where you align. Before we get into your congressional run, can you tell us a little bit about your background? What do you do for a living, and what led you to politics in the first place?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have worked in New York City for over 2 decades as a public defender at the Legal Aid Society, which is our largest public defender agency in New York. I worked in the criminal defense division, which means I represented people accused of crime. I love that job. I was really good at that job. And I took some time off when my kids were born. I'm a mom of 4 children. My 4 kids go to school in the New York City public school system. And when my kids were starting to get on in school, I wound up joining my community board. Then I ran for the school board. I became the president of the largest school board in Manhattan. And I went back to work as my kids got a little bit older. And I was working and I was involved in my community, and I'm raising my kids, all going along really well and really easily. And then I did something that we're not supposed to do these days, which is say exactly what I thought about the diversity, equity, and initiative trainings that were going on in my kids' school. I wrote an op-ed about a 2-day training that I went to that I found really awful. You were required to refer to yourself by race and refer to your children by race in order to be allowed to speak. And it's all part of this anti-racist curriculum and education training that was going on that, as far as I could see, wasn't making our schools better, wasn't doing a better job of teaching kids how to read, write, or do math, and was actually introducing this really toxic, divisive atmosphere into the parents and teachers and kids' environments. And so I wrote about it. And I wrote about it in the context of saying, of course, we want schools in New York City to be more integrated and do a better job teaching, but like, is this the right way to get there? And my job and my union came after me really, really hard. They wrote public statements defaming me, calling me racist, saying that I had no business working in that job. And
now you're talking about your job as a public defender.
Yes, I'm talking about my job as a public defender. Legal Aid Society is one of the many institutions that went woke. They were super, super woke. They bought into everything. One of the world's worst books, which is called White Fragility. And Ibram Kendi, who is someone who promotes anti-racism, which of course, everyone I know is against racism, but anti-racism is this idea of all white people are bad and all Black people are victims, and we have to, constantly self-flagellate and lash ourselves with our history in this country of being imperfect. I think that's all nonsense. I think we have an amazing country. I think we're lucky to be born Americans. And I think there's a good reason why so many people of every color, but particularly non-white people, want to come to America and risk life and limb sometimes to get here, because we're an amazing country that actually gives people across the board of any gay, straight, Black, brown, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, whoever you are, if you work hard, you have a real shot at making something of yourself in this country. It's not a perfect country. I've never said it is. I know I can catalog things we've gotten wrong, but it's a really great country. And there's this relentless negativity that they're trying to teach in our kids' school, that we're a sexist country, a racist country, that we're bad, that we're a compilation of bad things, and we're not. Right. And I spoke up about it. And I was the head of the school board, and we were talking about integration plans. And I ran afoul of the far left of my party, of my city, of my community, and I got sort of slaughtered for it. And Barry Weiss, who does a great job with her podcast and her Substack right now, chronicling stories of people who have been canceled and people who are speaking up, heterodox opinions were speaking up. She wrote about me. And so then a lot of people sort of got to know about what was going on in my life. Also there, because of the internet, Brandon, our school boards went on Zoom when COVID hit, and we had some crazy school board meetings, which is not hard these days. There's a lot of crazy school board meetings out there. But we had a school board meeting go crazy because a bunch of people got mad at one of my fellow board members, who's a white man, who had his friend's black child on his lap for a brief period of time. I know you're giving me that funny look, like, why would that bother anybody?
Right.
Nobody sane would be bothered by that, right? Because we hold our friends' kids, even when they're different colors than us, on our laps sometime. And because of Zoom, we multitask and have meetings and deal with childcare and stuff. But if you buy into this anti-racist rhetoric, you become obsessed with race, and you start to tell the kids and the schools to become obsessed with race. I feel like it's robbing a certain innocence from kids. Gender ideology does the same thing, but we don't have 24 hours to cover all the topics to talk about today. But for me, it's like the innocence of kids should be protected. Their childhood should be protected. And the crazy race stuff and the bad COVID policy were both two things I saw robbing my kids, but also the hundreds of thousands of other kids in New York City schools, robbing them like the childhood they deserve, of the childhood that the kids should have. You should go to school with your friends of the same color, friends of different color. And I spoke up about it, and I got really beat up for it. And in New York, I ran for city council last year. I did not win that election. And I'm running for Congress now for a bunch of reasons, but one of them is because so many people come up to me and say, I heard you speak at that school board meeting, or I heard you speak at that rally to open schools, or I read the article about you. I agree with you so much more, but I can't talk up because it would be bad for me at work, or I'm a single mom, I can't lose my job, or I can't speak up. And for lack of a more eloquent word, it just pisses me off to be an American and to hear so many fellow Americans be living self-censorship, right? Living this thing where, of course, you're American. We have First Amendment rights. Like, you should absolutely be able to say the most unpopular opinions. And if your neighbors think your opinions suck, they can say your opinions suck, right? Like that's not, maybe I'm not at my most eloquent the way I'm framing it, but like, free speech means the freedom to say bad ideas out loud. And I don't think my ideas are bad. I think I'm right. And I think I speak for actually most Americans, Democrats and Republicans, when I speak up on behalf of our kids having a right to a normal childhood, on the reality that our country is at base a good country. But there's this really, claustrophobic thing that's going on in the Democratic Party, especially in places like New York City, where I live. I live in Lower Manhattan. And there's this real desire to shut people up, right? And you call people racist, you call them transphobic, you call them bigoted, you call them prejudiced, you call them right wing. If in my circles and Democratic circles, that's what they call you if they think that, if they want to try to shut you up and invalidate your arguments and your opinions.
The term far right has become, to me, it seems that any person who has an opinion that's out of favor with the acceptable narrative that the left, whatever that narrative happens to be on that particular day, is automatically labeled far right. I'm now far right. Yeah. I'm a gay person who is for gay marriage. I don't think I could possibly be more socially liberal. I actually find my opinions to be fairly centrist and middle of the road. But you said that you kind of, engage in this cardinal sin of speaking out and telling the truth. And I engaged in my own sin of being a gay man who no longer could adhere to this. As you just said, you called it claustrophobia. It's a form of kind of strangulation. It's restricting in a way that I just can't abide with. And for me, the only solution was to free myself of it and leave. And you made so many salient points, but I think, if we focus for just a moment on the race thing and the diversity thing, what's so fascinating to me is that since I walked away from the left, I now found myself on the right, which for the record, the walkaway movement is not about that. We don't tell people to become Republicans or tell them to become Trump supporters. What we say in walkaway is that it's a journey, not a destination. It's basically a movement and a network of people supporting each other as we all go on our own journey, do our own research, ask our own questions, and find out where that path leads us ultimately, which is different for everybody. But on my own journey, I've met a lot of Black and Hispanic and LGBT and Muslim and Jewish and all different types of people who have either left the left or perhaps they were always on the right. And what's so fascinating to me is that those people are not at all respected or tolerated by the movement of diversity and tolerance. And in fact, a lot of my Black conservative friends have children. And they are very much object to CRT and a lot of the diversity education that's found its way into schools. And then they get attacked. One of my good friends, Shamika Michelle, has a lot of daughters. And she said a number of times, and not just her, but many others have said, my children didn't see themselves as different than the other kids until the education system insisted that they were. And insisted that they see themselves that way. And so I don't, add to your point, I don't really think that there's anything particularly beneficial or uplifting to telling racially diverse children that they need to be categorized into different boxes, and some boxes are better than others.
100%. It's funny you mentioned Shamika Michelle, because I went on the Cut the Bull podcast that she does with Charles Love. And tomorrow night, since I'm running for office, I have to raise money. I'm doing a fundraiser, and Charles Love is speaking at this fundraiser that I'm doing. Charles, like me, is a public school parent here in New York City, and he's Black, and his child is Black. And he and I talk. We both have sons that are, young, going into first grade, and we talk about how pissed off we both are, a white woman and a Black man, about constantly telling our kids that are so young to pay so much attention to the color of their own skin and the color of the skin of their friends, because it's 2022. If we're not teaching this to our kids, honestly, they would grow up in one of the most beautiful, truly colorblind societies. Not colorblind, like you don't notice that people are, of course you notice if someone's tall or short or fat or kind or, but you have to force this issue of race into kids' life, because kids are my children. My eldest boy is 16, and I have 4 kids, my 16, 14, 12, and 6. And so, which is actually kind of interesting, because what my eldest son went through his whole elementary school years without this DEI, like this intense CRT. So I actually saw in a very short period of time, over 10 years, a real change in one single elementary school here in Manhattan. And what Charles and I talk about is, it's really unfair and unkind to these kids to force them to think about everything through race. You want to go to a class, a critical race theory class in law. I was in law school. I'm an attorney. I took critical race theory. I had the classic book, Critical Race Theory. Okay, you can. It's a totally legitimate thing to say, what if we examine our laws through the lens of race? Okay, write your papers on that, do that. But you're going to 6-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds who are in kindergarten and telling them that they're fundamentally different from their friend who has different skin color. And it's a lie. They're not. And it's a pernicious lie, because for me, it like robs kids of an innocence. If you don't tell your kid that the other child sitting next to them is fundamentally different from them, they will explain to you who has the best Pokemon cards and who can run the fastest and who can write. They'll tell you the important stuff. If you stop talking about race so gosh darn much and stop pushing your agenda on these young kids,
When I was growing up, which was, a minute ago, a few minutes ago, but, I grew up in a tiny, tiny little town in rural Nebraska and I grew up at a time when certainly, I would say if you were really on a search for the height of racism or bigotry that you could find in the country, that might be an area where you would start looking. And I can say it really, honestly, was not a thought in our minds. Now, granted, I grew up in a town where the majority of kids were white, but one of my best friends growing up was Filipino. and we had Mexican students in our schools too, and we just simply never thought about it. And my friend who was Filipino, he was in my, from day one in kindergarten, he was there. And I guess if I really had to search back in my mind, I think that there probably was a moment where I looked at him and recognized that he looked a little different than the rest of us. And then I don't think it was ever a thought again. And it wasn't even really until we were in high school that I started thinking to myself, like, he's Filipino. And I wonder, that's interesting, because like, there's not really many people who aren't Caucasian in this, but it just wasn't in our minds ever. Right. And I think that now with this being like you're saying, something that they're encouraging people, see yourselves as different, see yourselves as unequal, and and I think most dangerously telling non-Caucasian children to see white children as potential oppressors is incredibly dangerous, not to mention, I would say, blatantly racist.
Well, for me, I have 3 sons and a daughter. And for me, it's also like this, we hear the phrase toxic masculinity a lot. And when you combine this sort of white supremacy culture with toxic masculinity, and then you combine it with rape culture, and at the end of the day, it's like and then you say we want to change our curriculum because we don't want to read just dead white men, as if that's the only way to consider Shakespeare, is like a dead white man. But at the end of the day, I'm like, it must really suck to be a young white male in school today, right? Because the young guys that I went to elementary school with weren't constantly told that they're on team terrible, like you're on team awful, you're just from the worst group of people ever. And these kids are really young, and that message is relentless. Like, it doesn't stop. And and people say like, oh, we're not, when we're talking about white supremacy culture, we're not talking about white people. Well, explain that to a 6-year-old, right? Is that you're introducing these concepts to kids at a really young age. And here's the thing, for me, as a candidate for public office, it's like, you can totally disagree with me. You can say, Maud, America is the most racist country, and we have to do these DEI trainings. But let's have a conversation about it, right? Like, let's talk about, oops, I had to fix something there on my screen. Let's have a conversation about it.
Right. Sorry, say that again.
Let's have a conversation about it. Like, let's talk about it. Let's not just start from the assumption that everyone's racist and we're a terrible racist country. And so, because that's a ridiculous place to start. If that's your opinion, okay, I'll hear what you have to say about it and I'll talk to you about it. But we're not going to start there because that's the problem with a lot of the training.
Well, and so, and you just hit the nail on the head too, I think, with a lot of the frustration that so many people feel who are not on the left, wherever they fall on the spectrum, because we've kind of gotten to this place now. And I believe that, ironically, you and I met on Twitter, but I think that Twitter is like the 7th ring of hell, like the worst place anyone could ever possibly be. But it does get a little mind-numbing at times when you're having an argument. For me, I now find myself on the right. I'm constantly arguing with people on the left, and it kind of becomes this: you're in a cult, no, you're in a cult, no, you're in a cult, no, you're in a cult, and it just goes back and forth. And it becomes very clear to me that they see me and people like me exactly the way that I see people like them. And then sometimes I ask myself, well, if we're both saying the same thing and thinking the same thing about each other, who is right and who is wrong? But then I remind myself, my side is always willing to show up and debate, always. And the left is not, anytime that I've ever gone to the left and said, okay, you're saying that I'm a white supremacist, you're saying that I'm a Nazi, you're saying that I'm a self-loathing gay man. Let's argue this out. Let's debate this. And then the response I always get is, why would I have a debate with a Nazi?
Well, I'll tell you directly to that point. I'm running for office. I'm in this congressional campaign. And if I may say, if anyone likes anything I have to say, they should go check out my website, which is maudmaron.com. As a candidate, I go to a lot of forums. I go everywhere that I'm asked. So, I show up. But this past week, last week or the week before, I was disinvited or uninvited to a collection of forums, including groups like Lambda, like progressive organizations and organizations that supposedly are gay rights or gay friendly organizations. I was disinvited because I'm what we call gender critical. I think Title IX and the federal government should keep its biological sex category and not switch to gender identity. I can, I have all my specific reasons. I can talk to people who agree or disagree with me, but that's what I believe. There's 13 of us running in this race. They wouldn't let me come speak. It was 5 different organizations wouldn't let me come speak because they don't agree with my positions. So they got 13 people in a room who all agree with each other to talk about the issues. And they kicked out the one woman who has a different point of view. How does that democracy? How is that productive, right? And I was kind of embarrassed for them. I thought it was ridiculous. It also is hard for me because I can't talk to the potential voters because I'm being left out of the room.
Well, and I would actually argue, too, that it's entirely likely that of the remaining people who were invited, not everyone agrees with these people, but they understand that we live in that, at least that side of the fence lives in a world of forced conformity, where
Yes.
Here are the lines that you have to deliver. Here are the things that you're allowed to say if you want to be allowed in the door. And people are just saying them, even if they don't believe in them,
right.
at this point, because the alternative is to be excommunicated.
Yeah. No, totally and completely. I see it again and again with this. People who will tell you privately, I agree with you, but they won't say it and they won't speak up publicly. Let me just give you my tip on Twitter, though. I block everybody who's nasty and mean. And the result is I have a wonderful time on Twitter because I don't block people who disagree with me. If you want to disagree with me about schools, about gender, about DEI stuff, I'll talk to anybody, including people who think I'm wrong. But if you're nasty, if you're rude, if you're a name caller, then I don't want to waste my time with you. And so you can create, for me, I have found a community of open school moms and dads. The dads are in there too, but there's a lot of moms in different cities, comparing notes, talking about the regulations that kept our kids out of school for so long and the masking, the quarantining, the testing, all of this stuff. And we created a real community online, and it's very helpful to share information. And the same thing with the gender critical crowd, right? The crowd of people who are opposing gender ideology, which honestly, in my mind, is one of the most homophobic things that's come up in my lifetime. The sort of reification of gender roles, like if you're a slightly effeminate boy, we can't even make room for the fact that maybe you're just a kind of effeminate guy, maybe you're gay, maybe you're not, who cares, who knows, but like you're a kid, leave them alone. Instead, it's got to be you're born in the wrong body. And to tell that to young kids, to tell it to girls who are maybe lesbians, maybe going to grow up to be lesbians, because they're tomboys, or they want to cut their hair, or they don't want to wear dresses. There's nothing wrong with kids who reject 1950s style gender roles, like strict gender roles. And I'm mystified by what my community, which I, as a Manhattanite, as a Democrat, always thought of myself as as progressive. I don't use that word anymore because I don't like what the crowd that calls themselves progressive is talking about. But as a lefty progressive person, it's like, how can you run around telling kids that depending on what toy you play with, or how you cut your hair, or what clothes you wear, there might be something wrong with you. You might need surgery and hormones to change your body. That to me is the most regressive, homophobic, like really anti-child position to take. And you can disagree with me, but at least be brave enough to have the conversation. Like, how hard is it to say, hey, Maud, no, you're wrong. Let me tell you why. Instead, it's like, you're a bigot, you're a transphobe. We won't even talk to you. We won't let you in the room.
Well, and I think that also, that side needs to understand too, that they're the ones really saying how complex these situations are, which I agree with. So if something is complex, you need to appreciate that there's oftentimes nuance, a lot of nuance in these conversations, and that somebody can believe that it's dangerous to be telling, and this is a very real thing that I'm about to say, that there are young people, preteens and teens who are autistic, who are socially awkward, who just don't know themselves yet, and are being preyed upon by this notion that perhaps all your life will get better and your problems will go away if you embrace the idea that you were born in the wrong body. that's the wrong message for the wrong person. And we should be able to have that conversation while still acknowledging that some people are actually transgender and deserve to be treated with compassion and deserve to get the help and support that they need. But it's also incredibly dangerous to just for the default to be anybody who's having a tough time should just change their gender and life will get better.
The most powerful voices against childhood transition that I've heard are trans people themselves who have found real happiness through transition, for whom transition was actually a really good thing in their life, and from detransitioners, right? From young people who got, rushed into or pushed into transition because people just agreed with them all the time without actually taking time to talk to them about other things that might be going on in their life. So trans people who have found real happiness through transition, and who are living their best life as a transgender person, and detransitioners who understand the journey when it happened and it wasn't right for them, those voices, I'm pretty confident in my own belief system, but when you hear from those voices too, you think I'm right about the fact that we're getting it wrong for young kids in this country. There's just no way that this explosion of trans kids that we can't look at it without understanding this social contagion that's going on, and do a much better job than we're doing. It's one of the things where I feel like, for me, part of why I want to go to Congress is we need Congress people who are brave enough to stand up and say, wait, what's going on here? We actually need to have some guidelines about prescribing irreversible puberty blockers to young kids, about having surgery, about putting kids on a hormonal and surgical road that they can't undo, and doing it so early with so little safeguards. We don't do anything else with so little safeguards as we're doing this kind of gender medicine. And we need to talk about it, and we need to put in place some safeguards for kids and for families.
Again, I'm trying to have as open mind as I possibly can, but to me, you sound like every conservative that I know these days in 2022. All right, so let's dive into this. You're now a congressional candidate running as a Democrat, and given the views that you have right now, how is that going? Where do you stand with things right now?
Look, the district where I live in Lower Manhattan, it includes Chinatown. It includes a neighborhood called Borough Park in Brooklyn, which is a conservative Jewish neighborhood. It includes Sunset Park, which has a big Hispanic community. There are lots and lots of registered Democrats who sound just like me in New York City. I can't speak for anywhere else, and I don't know anywhere else, but there are lots and lots of Democrats who agree with me, and Republicans too. I have, like I said, Republicans, a lot of Republicans were registered Democrats in the mayoral election, and we're lucky that we got Eric Adams out of he was the most conservative and most moderate candidate out of a large Democratic field. A former cop, like someone who didn't, wasn't a defund the police guy. We had a lot of defund the police candidates, and there's nothing positive there for a city with a rising crime rate. So I think, for better or worse, for now, it may change. I mean, this midterm election is going to be significant, and 2024 is going to be significant in our country. It may change, but for now, in the vast majority of races in New York City, the Democratic primary is the de facto general election. So So I think it's a good thing for Democrats now to have, in New York City, to have a real choice. There are defund the police super liberal candidates in this primary, and there's me, and there's people in between. But this way, by being out here, by talking about these ideas, I give Democrats a real choice. And I'm the choice that I've wanted, that I've seen missing from the Democratic stage. And so I'm running because I'm like, nobody else is saying the things that I know to be true, the things that are important. And I want to present that alternative to my fellow Democrats.
When you look at your fellow candidates and you kind of see the trajectory that, I think a lot of people in your party are on, we on the conservative side talk a lot about how the Democratic Party is becoming increasingly socialist, increasingly, we often say Marxist. We say some of us, myself included at times, even say it's becoming very communist. Does any of that ring true to you, or what's your opinion on those things?
So I'll tell you, as someone who comes out of the school board fights, there are a lot of Chinese American and a lot of Eastern European American immigrants to New York City who use those words, Marxists and communists. And at first, when it would come up, I'd be like, what are you talking about? This isn't Marxism. We're just talking about the bad curriculum that they're trying to introduce in the schools, or they're trying to get rid of our merit-based admissions. But if you take the time to listen to people and talk to people, as I've been trying to do, eventually you sometimes realize some people know more than you do. And
Right.
I've learned, especially from some of the immigrants, the Polish, Lithuanian, these Eastern European immigrants who say, Maud, we know what this is. This is communism. We've seen it before. Our family left to get away from it. And it's a really compelling story that immigrants in the city are telling native-born New Yorkers and people who have been here for a long time. They're giving a warning. They're the canary in the coal mines that are saying, like, you're running away from your democracy. And just because you call it diversity, equity, and inclusion doesn't make it democratic or good or good for you or your kids or your city. And I think they have a point. And I started to see what they were talking about when, especially for me, with the censorship, right? There's a party line, right? In communist countries,
Right.
there was one thing you were allowed to say and you weren't allowed to deviate. And now, as you and I started this conversation, Brandon, it's like, now there's only certain things you have to say that trans women are women. And you're like, but no, they're not. They're men who want to live as women, and that's okay. And if it works for some people, great, enjoy, like, have a great life. But you're not a woman. You're a man who's choosing to live as a woman. But in my city right now, in the left-wing politics, if you say that, you get in trouble, even if it's true. Even if you're sitting next to a trans woman who says, no, I'm a man who's I'm biologically male, you're still not allowed to say that.
You'll
So,
also lose your Twitter account. You'll also be
sure
banned
will.
on social media. And
Absolutely.
I recently interviewed a gubernatorial candidate on the West Coast. We did a live event together, and throughout the course of that conversation, which was live streamed to my YouTube channels, she is a big proponent of election integrity, and she has very strong opinions about what went on in the 2020 election. In my opinion, it doesn't matter what I think, what you think, or what anybody else thinks about what did or didn't happen in 2020. I should be able to interview somebody and ask them a question and get an answer, but I've already gotten strikes on my YouTube account because of the answers she gave to those questions. And we're now going to have to take those videos down. And so when we're talking about things like fascism, communism, suppression of speech, this is a very real thing.
Right.
If you're not even allowed to ask people questions, and you're not even allowed to say, what do you think about what happened in the election? What do you think about COVID? What do you think about masks and vaccines? We can't even ask these questions without losing our reach on social media. That doesn't happen in the reverse. I don't see Republicans telling people, you're not going to be allowed to exist in the digital square if you say things that are out of alignment with what we believe.
One of the people I'm running against is Dan Goldman. Dan Goldman was the attorney who was the prosecuting attorney in the Trump impeachment, and he's running in this race. He just put out an op-ed saying that he thinks it should be a federal crime. I want to get the words right that he said, but a federal crime to have election misinformation. Misinformation about election administration should be a federal crime. I mean, my eyes want to pop out of my head. Are you kidding me? Like, if someone is saying something that's not true, the best thing to do is meet it with better speech. You say, like, you're wrong, and here's why. I bring the receipts. I'll show you why you're wrong about that. I think it's terrifying when people in power say, we want to make opinions that are different opinions than ours a crime, right? Like that, talk about communism, like saying anyone who says something about an election that I disagree with, I'm going to make that a crime. It's such a bad idea, and it's so undemocratic. And the First Amendment it's the first one because it's the most important one. Like, without free speech, we really don't have. Unfortunately, Brendan, you say, like, you're getting these strikes against you. You're not alone. There's so many voices out there that got shut down for COVID opinions that then a year later become mainstream. Right? Like, you weren't allowed to say COVID might have come from a lab in Wuhan. You weren't allowed to say, like, there might these vaccines might not prevent transmission. You weren't, and now we can all say that. but we weren't allowed to originally. And no, the people who were telling you you weren't allowed to say it in the first instance, no one's come back to be like, oh, my bad, sorry. Like we got that
your
wrong.
account is reinstated now. Yeah. Right.
So,
100%.
it's reinstated, but then you walk more gingerly, right? Like you're a little bit more careful because it's like, oh, I don't want to be kicked off again. I probably don't walk as gingerly as I should, but but it's
Right.
not a good place to be when you're being silenced.
Well, and this, again, for those of, I'm speaking for myself and many other people who find ourselves right of center, we've watched, and let me first of all preface this by saying that I certainly would never in a million years suggest that I think that both sides have narratives about certain situations. I think whether you're watching Fox News or you're watching CNN, you're going to find bias, you're going to find slant. In certain situations, you may even find omissions. I'm not pretending like that only exists on one side of the aisle. But I am saying that after Donald Trump got elected, what we saw in terms of media narratives that are being presented by the left is above and beyond anything that I've ever seen in my life. I watched for years as I personally at times was present at Trump rallies while he was speaking, saw what he actually said, heard what he actually said, went home that night, turned on the news and heard about a racist tirade that went on at this trial. And I'm going, what? And then you see this little soundbite that's isolated out of context. And then, I think even more egregiously, once we got into 2020, we all from coast to coast in some way or another witnessed, whether it was only on, Twitter or Instagram, or whether we went out into neighborhoods in our own communities and saw buildings being boarded up, saw rioters smashing windows, stealing merchandise, stealing, looting, hurting people, beating people, at times even killing people, and then turning on CNN and MSNBC and hearing about a summer of love and the mostly peaceful protests of BLM. And then we ask ourselves, so you guys get to be the people who decide what is misinformation and then criminalize it for the rest of us? Right. I mean, that's to me, I think, the most horrifying prospect, and what has caused so much fear. I mean, it's always scary anytime you hear people talking about criminalizing speech, but when the people talking about criminalizing speech are the people purveying the most misinformation, I think, of anybody, that's doubly horrifying.
100%, Brandon. And you know what? For me, because I live in Lower Manhattan, I live in Soho, which is a neighborhood that was looted, and that saw in the summer of 2020 the riots that went on. Every store on the block that I live in had boarded up windows. So when you see with your own eyes what's actually going on, and then you're told something different is going on, you lose faith. You lose faith in the media, in your institutions, and that loss of faith in public health because of the misinformation that they've been giving us, and the loss of credibility in the media when they tell you that these are peaceful protests, and you're like, no, they're not. I looked out my window and saw what was actually happening. It makes you look at everything differently. And because I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and I know you went through the criminal justice system because of January 6th, I look at those cases differently. I've represented lots of people accused of crimes, serious crimes, not so serious crimes. I've represented people who were very guilty of the crimes that they were accused of, and people who were not, people who were actually innocent, or people who had done things that were significantly less than what they were charged with. And the fact is, the imbalance between the way the rioters and the looters were treated in the summer of 2020 and the way the people in January 6th were being treated offends my sense of fairness. Now, to be clear, there are people who should have been prosecuted in both situations, right?
Sure.
Like the people who were rioting, a lot of people should have been arrested and prosecuted. And some of what I saw on January 6th really disgusted me. It said the peaceful transition of power in our country is incredibly important. And if somebody broke the law, they should be prosecuted. But what I saw is that people who were merely present or people who had walked through open doors were being treated like terrorists. And it's like, wait a second, the guy who smashed the windows and walked out of the store with his arm full of stolen goods and was filmed doing it, walked away and didn't even get arrested. But people who, I saw people get caught up in a moment that didn't actually commit any crime. There were people who committed crimes in January 6th, and I think they should be prosecuted, but there were other people who didn't. Merely being present is not a crime. And so it really frustrates me. And by the way, now that I've just said this to you, I'm going to get in so much trouble as a Democrat running for office for having said this, but it's true, right? Like there's nothing more important than that the administration of justice be blind, that it not be Republican or Democrat, that it not be political, that if someone's freedom and liberty is at stake in this country, the administration of justice has to be blind. It has to be fair. That's why Lady Justice is blind. And that makes me enormously nervous and worried when I see us go down politicized prosecution.
Well, first of all, let's acknowledge the fact that you and I are 100% on the same page. And I have never heard a single Republican or conservative say that people who broke the law on January 6th should not be prosecuted and should not face a just and fair result for what they did. I feel that way. Every conservative and Republican I know feels that way, even though the media loves to present this idea like Republicans feel like January 6th was no big deal. And they sort of manipulate this narrative. I can't remember who it was said that this is protected speech or something when talking about the context of simply being there, simply being at the rally. Illegal activity is illegal activity. Protected speech is protected speech. And that was the difference that was being acknowledged at that time. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that people are deeply concerned. And I think what's so bothersome for so many people is that a lot of people on the left have become very entitled to believe that the causes they care about are very important. And because they're very important, the rules shouldn't necessarily apply, or that the lines should be blurred because, if we're talking about 2020, well, it's racial justice. Come on, we're talking about racial justice. We don't arrest violent. Protests get violent sometimes when you're fighting for racial justice. That's the way it is. We shouldn't be punishing people who got a little out of hand when they were fighting for racial justice. But I don't understand who gets to decide that racial justice is more important than people who believe that their vote is being stolen. And I think that violence is violence, and it's not acceptable in either situation. But I think that people on the left really need to take a moment to examine their own belief system and realize just because you feel strongly about something. And by the way, people on the right also care very much about racial injustice. It's deeply important to us too. But when people feel, and it's interesting now, because now the January 6th committee is basically creating a story that this was an organized coup by Donald Trump and his administration and his operatives leading up to January 6th. And now I see people on the left becoming absolutely infuriated at the notion that there was an organized effort to overthrow the election. And I think to myself, but that's how everyone on the other side felt. This anger that you're feeling is how other people felt. It doesn't matter who was right or who was wrong. You care about the idea of an unfair election just as much as the other side cares about the idea of an unfair election. And just because you might feel that it wasn't unfair doesn't mean that it doesn't matter when other people feel that way.
No. And I'll say this directly to that point as well about who decides what's most important. During the riots in 2020, our schools were closed down, and they had been closed down for months. And we were told we weren't allowed to go outside, that the playground closest to my kid's house had a padlock on it, right? Nothing is more important in terms of COVID, as I can tell, is being healthy and being of a healthy weight and being, getting outside and getting some sunlight. But our kids were locked out of school, locked out of their sports, were closed down. And then all of a sudden, everyone's marching outside for racial justice, which is incredibly important. I agree with you about that, Brandon, but it's not more important than kids going to school. And there were plenty of Black and brown kids that were locked out of school. Where's the racial justice in saying, I want to stand up for an African-American community, but I want to lock African-American kids out of school? It makes no sense. All kids, by the way, belong in school, but there wasn't even a logic to it. And for me in New York City, it was incredibly frustrating to watch that, it's okay to gather in big groups and hundreds of people to be outdoors to protest something that we tell you is important, but your 20 kids can't go to their pre-K class together and sit down on the rug together and sing a song together because that's not important enough to buck COVID protocols. That infuriated me.
So let me ask you something. Given what you believe, given what you've been through, given the way you've been treated by people within your own party, why are you still a Democrat? What are you holding on to?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm holding on to what I've always thought the Democratic Party was about and what I have lived as a Democrat. But someone asked me this the other day, and I said, I feel like I'm in marriage counseling with the Democratic Party. I'm happily married to my husband. We've been together now we've been married for 17 years, together for over 20. But with the Democratic Party, I feel like I'm in marriage counseling, because I am saying, if you can't run as a Democrat and I'm a pro-choice Democrat, I'm a pro-labor Democrat, I am a public school parent, I am a public defender by training, I am someone who believes in the Bill of Rights is incredibly important. And if there's no room for me in the Democratic Party, then there's not room for a lot of people. So a little bit, I feel like, let's make this work, because if this doesn't work, it's not just me, it's a whole lot of people who are going to figure out, like, well, if this isn't the right party for me, where do I go from here?
You know, as a gay person, the message that I received for a long time was that the only choice that I had was to be a Democrat, and that I was not wanted or accepted anywhere but the Democratic Party. I, through my own research and my own, reading and watching videos and studying and looking at the issues and digging deeper, I discovered that this is no longer the right place for me to be. And I've come over to the right. I personally couldn't possibly consider the idea of going back to the Democratic Party in its current state. But see, I don't like that either, because now I'm once again in a position where I feel like I only have one choice in one party. And I don't want to pledge my eternal allegiance to the Republican Party, because they've got their problems too. They've got their issues. So one thing that I like about you, and that I find interesting about you, and why I wanted to do this interview, is that right now, at least, it sounds like you would like to stay, maybe through your counseling, your marriage counseling, and you'd like to stay, you'd like to find a way to make things work. And in my mind, that would be ideal. I would love to live in a world where I don't feel like I only have one choice, where I can say, you know what, I love what this Democrat has to say about this, and I really like what this Republican has to say about that, and I'm going to mix my vote up and down the ballot. I think that would be ideal. I don't believe it's the world we live in right now. Can we ever get there?
Well, I'll tell you what would 100%, that is what we need, because we should, as voters, have Republicans and Democrats vying for us. That would give us the most power. That's how voters would have the power, right? Because right now, the separate primaries, the way it works, at least in New York, is the Democrats are trying to meet the Democratic base, which pulls them to the left. The Republicans get pulled to the right. And the people in the middle, I think moderate Democrats and Republicans in my city agree with each other more than they do with the extremes of their own party, right? So if I would like to see open primaries, or any system that would make it such that I could choose to vote for a Republican or a Democrat, and that way they would both have to court my vote. Right? I want to be courted. I'm in marriage therapy. I want to be courted. It's all very romantic. But I think that's the best way to give voters the power, right? Is if the people who are running for office had to look at all the people who could vote and say, I'm gonna listen to all of them because I want their vote. And that would give the voters the most power. And that's what I think we need.
Gotcha. So at this point where things stand right now, well, first of all, what would you like people to know about you as a candidate leading up to the election this year? And what do you feel the future is for you as a politician, should you not get elected this time around?
Yeah. My election's on August 23rd. And like I said, it's maudmaron.com. It's MAUDMARON. It's my name, maudmaron.com. You can send me a message through there. You can donate to me through there. You can find out what my platform is about through the website. And really, I am what I call a common sense Democrat. I want to have enough police that are well-trained and that are doing their job well, which means transparency and accountability from our police department, but it also means enough police to arrest the bad guys and to be on the subway where there's crime, so that we can have safe subways, we can have safe streets. I'm a school choice person. I think when we see how badly our schools got mismanaged, we have to give parents the choice of where to send their kids. In my city, we've had dramatically declining enrollment from our public schools, and we've had an increase in religious schools and parochial schools and yeshivas and homeschooling and private schools, and in people just moving out of state to go to different schools. So we know parents are unhappy. Trapping them in a system where they don't have choice is wrong. And we need to lower the taxes in New York City. We are getting, it's expensive as heck to live here, and it's getting less safe, less clean, and less livable for families with kids. So we're losing. Part of why we got redistricted is because we lost a congressional seat, and that was pre-COVID. And now we've lost so many more people. If New York City and New York State wants to retain people and keep people here, we have to do a better job of actually listening to people. That's the kind of Democrat I am. I'm listening to people. I'm listening to my neighbors. I'm listening to people in all the communities of New York 10 and saying, okay, I hear you. Like, this is what we need to do. And so I think whether folks who want to support me should support me, not because I'm a Democrat, but because of my ideas, because of the voice that I would bring to Washington, DC. And also because, frankly, like you said, Brandon, like, we need Democrats like me. We need reasonable Republicans, reasonable Democrats, because when you get to DC, you actually do have to work with each other in order to pass national budgets and to pass legislation and to get things done. And I can talk to anybody and I can work with anybody. And I think we need more of that. And that's why it's really nice to talk to you, Brandon.
It's really great to talk to you too. Again, I'm trying not to editorialize. I keep listening to you and I'm like, we're this close to getting her. We're this close. So why don't we go out on that? I mean, is there a future that you see for yourself that one day might not include the Democratic Party, or is that just not even where your mind is right now?
When you're running a race, you're so focused on election day. So let's do this. I'm going to get through election day. I'm going to keep talking to as many Democrats as I can. Although in New York, the Board of Election has just said that people can switch their party up until election day. So anyone who wants to vote for me, even if they're not a registered Democrat right now in New York and New York 10, can register as a Democrat and can vote for me. So let me get through this election day, and then afterwards I'll give it some thought. We'll figure it all out, and maybe if you're ever in New York, I'll get a chance to talk to you then. Yeah,
you and I will meet. Maybe not even a year, maybe 6-7 months, same place, same time. We'll see where things stand. Before we go out, please tell everyone again where they can find you on social media. Tell everybody what your website is and how they can support.
Absolutely, maudmaron.com. You can donate through that. You can find out more information. You can get in touch with me through maudmaron.com. And all my social media is the same. It's my name. I don't do the anonymous troll thing. It's Maud Maron on Twitter, Maud Maron on Facebook, Maud Maron on Instagram. So I'd love to hear from people.
You see, now that's smart. Just so you know, I don't know if you did that on purpose. I fought really hard to get my name as my handle on everything, because a lot of people have a different handle on every platform and it makes it really difficult to find people. Yeah. I think it's super smart when people just have one consistent handle on every platform.
Yep,
so
that's me.
Good call on that. Maud, thank you so much for having this conversation. I'm really glad you reached out to me, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you and developing a friendship with you as the weeks and months and years go by.
Excellent. Brandon, thank you so much. I loved hearing about your story. I love learning about it, and very happy to have talked to you and to have met you.
All right. Thank you. Good luck with everything.